You may all be aware, it's all over the news that it's not a secret anymore, especially since 2013, after Snowden revealed all what the US government and the National Security Agency was doing with all the information collecting from people, organizations, institutions all over the world. So you already are familiar with that. Okay, just a second. Okay. Can I have some help here? Okay, never mind. I solved the problem. This was frozen, so. Maybe it didn't. So how is that for a technology conversation? Okay, excellent. So I'm sorry about the delay. I have put here a quote from one of the justices of the Supreme Court of Canada. It portrays a very doom and gloom future for us. So we can only be sure of being free from surveillance today if we retire to our basements, cloak our windows, turn out the lights, and remain absolutely quiet. So this was a quote taken from one of the decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, but the comment was taken from the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution. So then when I was trying to put things together, writing this paper, I tried to think about other works out there that talk about surveillance and the secret state and how different authorities use different surveillance mechanisms towards individuals. And George Orwell, 1984, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. It just portrays a society where everything is spied on, there is no privacy, everything knows everything about one another. And I personally have grown up in a country where something like George Orwell situation was happening there. So it really resonated with me, this idea of having no privacy at all, so state spying over you and getting the information that they want from you. Now, things have evolved a lot from 1984. Technology has offered us new ways how to spy more easier. Like just with a click of a button, you can get information from everywhere in the world, and this is becoming so easier now. Now, of course, that we have now, as I mentioned at the beginning, that there is mass surveillance of information of citizens, and Canada is not an exception. So even our government has been spying on us, and the 2013 Snowden revelations actually indicated that this was happening. And only then Canadian citizens got to know about it. So I put a definition here from Parson, what mass surveillance means. So this is his definition. But it's technically using information to get data from individuals. And it's not confined in domestic borders, but everywhere else. And I'll explain a little bit later that this happens especially with our two agencies that we have in place. They get information from foreigners everywhere, but also citizens, the Canadian citizens. Now, of course, technology is used by many entities, government and business companies. So my focus in this research paper is only on government surveillance. So you're well aware that companies also are engaged in this extraction of information with consent or not. So this is not the focus of my paper. The focus is just how government agencies spy on citizens. Mainly, the justification for this is the prevention of crime, terrorism, and things like that. So this kind of mass surveillance practice actually facilitates the continuous, sustained monitoring of individuals. And it's not done in a matter that is legally defined, that has strict legal borders, but it's out there with very loose legal boundaries, and this is actually what is being used a lot by these agencies. So, but indirectly, my paper also will deal with information that's taken up by the businesses and then kind of being sold to the government. So it's not unusual for the government actually to take information that's being collected by Google, Twitter, Facebook, and all of these big giant internet companies and using it for its own purpose. Now, we're talking about technology here, so I chose to mention some of the practices that government use to really get information. So Google Street View, it's what Google uses to really constitute the Google Maps. That was the main reason, but also see what people are doing when taking photographs and construing maps and everything. So this is taken by the government to really survey what people are doing as well. So this is an example how government takes information from the business. Drone technology is another very good example that drones can go everywhere. It's very easy, like you can command them from very long distance, and you can get information even from the window of a person's house. So it is very frightening, but this is happening as well. Again, using drones, urban space control and surveillance. So it's just using drones to see if crimes are happening around and if something has to be done by police, by RCMP, and all of these enforcement institutions. So this is something that's being used massively. Or police body-worn cameras are another example of how police are wearing cameras and going to talk to people, maybe visit people's houses, and really get that information from that technology, which in many cases is done without consent, so without people knowing that this is happening. Or CCTV, which is closed-circuit television. There are cameras put in the streets, and they see what people are doing, if there is any suspicious activity happening in the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So all of these activities are actually being used by the government. So my argument then is this, that the government's use of mass online surveillance has established a precarious new principle of acceptable privacy by normalizing the enormous power it grants government agencies and incapacitating the legality of democratic protections. So this would be the main argument that I am putting forward in this paper. And really, when I was doing research, I was trying to find out that disconnect that exists between us being free, freedom of expression, freedom of association, but also being a little bit afraid of how our words and discussions can be interpreted by these government agencies that are spying on us. So at some point in time, it can happen that we are actually a person of interest and being investigated and so on and so forth. So this then creates this kind of fear, insecurity, and a kind of a false expectation of privacy, which, by the way, is protected not explicitly but implicitly in the Constitution. So not the right of privacy per se, but expectation of privacy is actually upheld by constitutional principles in Section 7 and 8. So then I thought that it is really the time that we must revisit what we have in place. And there are many problems. This is the reason why we should revisit this. And I saw the objective of surveillance. So mainly government is using these mass surveillance practices to really prevent crime, terrorism, and so on and so forth. But is surveillance bad in itself? And of course it's not, because we are trying to balance the right of privacy or other rights, freedom of expression as well, with our safety and security, national security. So in and on itself, surveillance is not a bad thing. However, we have a very developed technological pace, like technology is developing very fast, but law is not catching up with it. So we have lack of regulation in this technological development. So this is another problem. Of course, all the agencies that I will mention in a second, they operate under a really thick cloak of secrecy. So they don't reveal to the citizens what they're doing, who are they surveying, what kind of surveillance practices are they using, why, for what reason, and this is a big problem as well. Or practices that are engaged in surveillance. All of these that I mentioned in the previous slides, we don't know what they're being used for. Another thing is that really connects to the main idea and the conclusion of my paper is that if surveillance in and on itself is not bad, then why do we have problems? It is because in many times the decisions are made by certain people who work in these agencies, and they have no control, no oversight, and mainly it is making decisions based on certain values, based on how they view certain communities, how they view certain people. So many people, without even knowing where this investigation is coming from, are faced with the challenges of going through a very hardship and difficult times, and you may have heard very lately the Diab case, the Hassan Diab case, who was imprisoned in France, and the main reason for that is that some secret agency, intelligence agency, actually had some suspicion on him and had to be extradited to France, and he suffered prison there. So I did a research, and that was the reason why the evidence that they provided is from intelligence agencies. Another problem is the cost. So how much are we actually willing to pay to keep up with all this technology? Because technology is not for free. We know it very well. So how much do we have to pay in order to keep up with the mass surveillance? So surveying everybody, everything that's happening around every day, on and on and on. Now, of course, we could not put a price tag on safety and security, but there should be some balance between some really grounded suspicion and the money that we're paying for it. And the last thing is the effectiveness. So, of course, we're doing all these mass surveillances, but are they effective? Are they really serving to prevent any crime, or just collecting information somewhere and then keeping it there just in case if it's going to be useful in the future for future investigation? So is this really effective and a really good use of the money that we're spending? The cases that maybe I will add on, because this is a work in progress. I haven't finished my research yet, but these two cases really are very significant. the RR case, which is not new, dates from 2002, and it has to do with the Syrian Canadian citizen that, based on some information of security and intelligence agencies, was brought by the U.S. forces and sent back to Syria, and was then tortured. And after it was found that evidence was not grounded, he was turned back in Canada, and then a whole commission was created, and there was some serious investigation. And the RCMP actually was held responsible for these not grounded investigations. And the Hassan Diab is the case that you may have heard the last, or maybe the 2 last weeks, that's all over the news. So these cases actually really indicate that there is something of normalizing this idea of surveillance. And even people are kind of accepting that we have to give up some level of privacy in order for us to be safe and to be secure from threats, especially terrorism. So it's this extent to which technological development are making us normalizing these kind of practices. So we don't really care anymore. And this is a very dangerous thing to do, because it really normalizes privacy limitations, and it makes us accepting all these surveillances, mass surveillances going on our private lives. So in Canada, we are part of a larger network that's international, and you may have heard about the 5i network, which is comprising of 5 states, and Canada is one of them, and the PRISM program, which is actually partnering with the big major internet companies and getting information from them. So the main giants are these that are listed here, and the Canadian government is actually involved with this kind of practices as well. And we have 2 agencies, the Canadian Security Establishment and the Canadian Secret Intelligence Services. These are the 2 agencies that deal with these kind of surveillances. The CSE is about getting information, but they claim that it's not about Canadians, it's about foreigners. But however, we have to keep in mind that information is not identifiable, and every information, including the Canadian citizens' information, can be subject to these surveillances. The other, so we have all these practices of the security establishment, gathering of publicly available information, although without consent, like Facebook, Twitter, all of these things are publicly available. However, they are not public information, they are private. And gathering illegal information from maybe people that are not entitled to share that information. So all of these things really are things that the CSE has been engaged with. The CSIS is another organization, another agency that deals with intelligence, and it collects information from Canadians as well. So they both have their fields of operations. And to protect ourselves from these agencies, there is some kind of test, especially to protect the right of privacy. And the harm test is one of the main tests that we have. So we have to make sure that citizens are not being affected by these surveillance practices. Now, what methodology do I use? Some of the legislation that we have in place, you may have heard about Bill C-51. That bill is actually in the House of Commons now, has passed first reading, so it is Bill C-59. So with the changing of the government, Trudeau government actually took as a responsibility to really take care of all the allegations that were being made about Bill C-51, that gave a lot of power to these 2 agencies, and how to really keep the power controlled and limited. So I will deal with all the debates and discussions that are being made currently at the House of Commons now, but also for Bill C-51 and another bill that deals with border control, which is Bill C-23. And I'll also make an analysis of the court cases that deal with these two agencies, the CSE and CSIS. So that will be kind of my where I will get the most of information to get into conclusion. And the position of Information Commissioner, who is the agency, the commission that deals with the protection and oversight of privacy of Canadian citizens, that will be a point of interest as well. So my expected conclusions will then be brought to a major scale. So I would expect from this research to see that mass surveillances will have a major impact not only in the privacy rights of Canadian citizens, but also on how we see each other. It will deconstruct our communities. It will actually make a huge impact in our idea of multiculturalism, because some marginalized communities are being objectified and being targeted in these surveillance practices. Then it will have major consequences on how we communicate with each other and with our government as well. So it will have major implication not only in our human rights, but also in our ideals of democracy and how we live with each other.